Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Travel Vault webinar. My name is Christina Brazier, and I'm the Operations Director at Travel Vault. And today I'm joined by Martin Alcock and Adam Pennefather of Travel Trade Consultancy, and Bruce Martin, Managing Director of the social media agency Ginger Juice and Travel Gossip, a large social network dedicated to the travel industry. We're covering a variety of topics over the next hour. Firstly, Martin's going to give us a general overview of the latest developments from the last couple of weeks. And then Adam will be taking us through the wonderful world of TOMS following the impact of Brexit and also currency to provide us with some practical advice on how to manage this going forward. We'll end the webinar with Bruce, who's going to be updating us on how to manage your social media as we emerge from the pandemic. As usual, all attendees will be muted for better sound quality, but we welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A function on your screen and I will be able to put them to our panelists. Finally, please note that the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later today. So with the formalities over, Martin, it's over to you if you'd like to share your screen. For all attendees, please note as well that Martin's only able to join us for the next 20 minutes or so, so please ensure that any questions for him are raised early on if possible.
No problem. Morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Right, hopefully you can see presentation deck there.
Yeah, thank you.
There we go. So what I thought I'd cover this morning really is I guess a few thoughts and a few early indicators on what we're seeing following the positive news about the vaccine. I mean, we're constantly over the course of the last 8 months of these webinars, we've been asking this question, what's the root out of all of this mess? And so I think it's worth just pausing to reflect on what we've seen really over the last few weeks. And look, undoubtedly, it's great news for the travel sector as well as humanity. And I suppose, and I should say this up front, like, trust me, I am an optimist by nature. I've been a Sunderland Football Club fan for 40 years now, and you get to learn a thing or two about looking on the bright side of life. And clearly the effort and skill that's gone into the scientific community moving heaven and earth and regulators to approve a vaccine in the short time frame is absolutely astonishing, and all credit to them. I guess the problem we have though is that now these professional, diligent, well-rounded scientists have to pass the baton on to our government to execute the next phase, and I guess that's really where I sort of worry a little bit about what the future holds. And I think there's plenty of unanswered questions really that ultimately will affect how quickly this pandemic can be brought to an end. I think firstly, you have to remember for a vaccine to really have an impact on travel and outbound travel, I think we need two things. I mean, I think, firstly you have to remember the vaccine doesn't stop you spreading the virus. It looks after, it prevents the symptoms, or it treats the symptoms. And so whilst that's great, and clearly that should absolutely be the focus, looking after the vulnerable, bringing down the death rate, etc., that alone won't stop us traveling freely again, because it's the travel, it's the spread of cases, and I guess specifically the introduction of new cases into a host country when somebody visits it, that's what's keeping the borders restricted at the moment, and that's what's driving the quarantine requirements. So I think for the vaccine to have an impact on travel, I think there's two things. Firstly, we need to have sufficient coverage of the population to reach this famous herd immunity that we've heard so much about over the last few months. And clearly I'm no epidemiologist, but that would seem to make sense, that enough people have to have taken the vaccine for it to have effectively stamped out that transmission. And I think the second important thing for travel is some sort of universally accepted means of proving that you've had the vaccine and that is accepted in the countries that you're traveling to. So getting to this herd immunity, and again, clearly I'm not a scientist, but again, it would seem logic to me that it made up of broadly three criteria. One is this efficacy measure that we've heard about, the level of success of the actual vaccine. The second is the take up, how many people actually take the vaccine, and the third is the logistics side of things. So clearly we've heard great news about the efficacy levels of the vaccines that are going to be offered to our population so far, and I can again, I'll take that as read, because I'm not qualified to sort of question any of that. I guess the rollout and the take-up, I think, are probably the two areas where you can see there are problems. I mean, even if you are prepared to overlook the missteps, many missteps of our government over the last few years, from track and trace to getting PPE equipment into the hands of the frontline workers, to awarding ferry contracts this time last year when we were facing this cliff edge of a potential kind of no-deal Brexit. I don't think you've got to be that much of a government skeptic to see that it's unlikely to be plain sailing. I mean, just to cover the most vulnerable in society and the frontline key workers is around 17 million people by some accounts. So huge effort to go through. And I think clearly that rollout will be impacted by this sort of vaccine hesitant anti-vax movement. I think, there are people out there who think this is Bill Gates's attempt to take control of all these elderly pensioners. And, whatever you think about that, it's clearly an issue, and it clearly will impact things. So I suppose from my reading of things, I think the vaccine alone doesn't get you to any kind of herd immunity sort of level of coverage until realistically Q3, back end of the summer, Q3 of next year. And again, let's hope we're wrong on that, but just a simple rollout logistics exercise alone would seem to make it a pretty complicated approach. You also have to remember that this needs to also be rolled out in all of the other destination countries that we're going to, because of that, that concern around transmission. I guess the other aspect that we talked about is this idea of there being some sort of universally accepted proof. And again, to me, it doesn't feel like there's any real signs that this is being planned for. I mean, there's something like 250 vaccines in various stages of production and testing around the world. And all of those have got different levels of this efficacy measure or longevity of how long they last and so on. And so without some sort of standardized approach about what's being accepted and what's not, you could well find that you've been given the medical equivalent of the Betamax video, where no country is willing to accept the version that you had, or you can't prove that you've had one that would be accepted by others. So look, in my most optimistic case, I don't see the vaccine alone having a material impact on people's ability to travel really until, like I say, Q3 or Q4 of next year. And so whilst it's clearly great news and it's clearly essential for long-term travel, I think in the short term, it's this idea of an effective testing regime. That's what's going to do the heavy lifting in the short term. We got this revision to the rules, this test to release process that comes into force on the 15th of December, which I think is the first signs we've really seen of some sort of recognition or coordinated support from the government. So essentially, people can take a test after 5 days and reduce their quarantine if that test proves that they aren't carrying the virus. It feels much more like a measure that will work for business travelers. I still feel like that's not going to move the dial for family travelers, for example. The big problem I see, though, is this fragmented approach that we've got to testing at the moment. I mean, just browsing the travel press over the last 2 weeks, all of these different organizations have introduced their own version of some form of testing as part of their product, whether that be an airport and how they're looking at things, or individual airlines. And you don't have to, again, look too far to see the problem with this. This fragmented approach means that, again, does the host country accept the version that's being rolled out? Does this patchwork approach, is there this mutual recognition that we can get to? And I think, again, it's the host country that's bearing the risk, and they are the ones that are going to need to be satisfied ultimately that the standard is and the testing is being carried out to the relevant level. There are some noises around bilateral agreements. So Spain and the UK government, for example, have been in talks about how that sort of regime could look at. But again, there's a lot of work there for the UK to go and put in bilateral agreements with every single organisation. So coordination on the testing side of things and some sort of regime is absolutely key. I guess the big fear is that with the vaccine coming over the hill, does that give the government enough of a reason to pull back on spending money on a regime when they can see the end in sight? Because clearly the vaccine is the beginning of the end, and the cavalry coming over the hill and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think we're out of the woods. I think, again, very, very likely we'll see this recovery of stop and start as we hit bumps along the road, a bit like we've seen over the last summer, where we had a government corridor lists announced and then countries quickly falling off it. And I think what some companies fell into the danger of was assuming that once the government had announced corridor lists, it would be a nice, smooth, linear improvement back to normality. And so when Spain was the first country to come off that list, it hit everybody, I think, psychologically quite badly. So I think we should be aware that it's not going to be plain sailing, but like I say, clearly it's good news. I just wanted to end on some signs of positivity that we are seeing. This is a summary of some of the data we've shared before, but this is on website hits, website heat maps. It's going all the way back to March. You might not be able to see the detail too much, but effectively the percentages in the boxes are the amount down relative to the same week in the previous year. So you've got the weeks running along the top there, and you've got different, I've just summarized it by the different product types rather than by individual individual companies within those product types. But if you just look at a couple of data points that we pull out over the last 12 months, firstly, go back to 10th of July, where you can see that tour operators on the second line down there, for example, had been trading at sort of 75% down for the early part of lockdown. And so when those first announcements were made, it jumped from 75% down to 47% down. So still a big way down on the previous year, but you could see that that really did move the dial quite significantly. Then work through the week of the 17th of August, we had Portugal added to the safe list. And so having travel kind of stalled a little bit, again, we ended up back at that 50%, 47% down sort of area. Then we had a succession of countries going back on the naughty step and things got a bit worse. But in October, when the Canaries were added to the list, we saw again, we got back to that sort of 55% down. You then bring onto that final box there, and this is really a series of announcements around the vaccines. The Pfizer and BioNTech announcement in that week of 9th of November was initially about the very strong efficacy levels, and that got a lot of press. Actually, that didn't really move the dial too much. You could see we dropped from sort of 75% to 65%, so it's a 10% improvement. But actually, in the very latest data, the most recent data we have, which is the very final column there for last week, you can see that we're back to, and this is really off the back of the announcement of the vaccine now being approved by the regulators and now being rolled out. And actually, in the recent days, we've heard the first doses are being given to people. You can see that we are back to some of the pretty positive territory of back at that 50% level. Now, I think you can see that this news does have an impact and does have an immediate, I should say that this is website hits, so it's not bookings. This is intention to book rather than actually does this flow through. But you can see that any good news customers are acting on, and I think that's great. And hopefully we will see a continual stream of this good news. But I think we should all just bear in mind that clearly we're not out of the woods and there's clearly risk. Just a final couple of points that I just wanted to flag. I think some interesting other points coming out of this data. I think, firstly, you can see cruise lines have been pretty flat throughout this, but actually have picked up themselves in that very final week. So that seems to be hitting all kind of demographics, and arguably good vaccine news does disproportionately affect the average cruise passenger sort of demographic more than others. But the other thing I thought was really interesting was the car hire figures, and you can see that they were down as far as everybody else was in those early days of lockdown, but actually have held up pretty well, only around 30% down for in some cases even lower for the rest of the season. Now, I think there's probably a couple of reasons. One, that could be them benefiting, car hire companies benefiting from more domestic travel. But I think there's a high likelihood that some of this is customer response to a fear of using public transport or mixing with other people and maybe looking to add car hire instead of taking a transfer, for example. And so I think there's a genuine opportunity there if that trend continues beyond this, that if you aren't offering car hire as part of your various holiday arrangements, it could well be something that customers are looking for and are buying elsewhere. So I thought it would be worth sharing that. But that's all I was going to say. Very happy to take any questions. Like Chris says, I'm really sorry. I do have to shoot off in about 15 minutes or so, but happy to talk in the meantime.
Thanks, Martin. I mean, that data is really interesting, actually reflects conversations that I've had with members over the last week, in that customer inquiries have been increasing, but it's actually the confidence to make the final booking that is lacking at the minute. Yes. Presumably that's the same with your clients. I mean, what do you think, what's your prediction for January, and what are you hearing? Because obviously that's usually a peak booking period for many in the industry. Do you think we will see some upturn then?
I think I'm pretty bearish about January, I've got to say. January is so important, as you say. For a typical summer holiday operator, they could expect 20% of their annual summer departures to make that commitment in January. And I think it's almost certain that that won't happen. I mean, there's this news that's just come over, we're just sort of digesting in the last 24 hours about implications of Brexit, which caught us a bit by surprise, I think, in that the UK, being a third country from the 1st of January, actually doesn't have any sort of travel rights into Europe because of this temporary COVID level of restrictions. All of those play on customers' fears of what might be around the corner. And so they could all well travel in the summer, but are they going to make that commitment in January? I feel fairly sure it's going to be a lot lower. And clearly that has ramifications on cash flow and commitments and currency buying and all those other things. So I think we're certainly not out of the woods, but those messages of positivity are consistent. We are hearing lots of customers saying, lots of our clients saying that people are willing to start engaging and start that process. And that's all, they're all steps on this journey of recovery, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so confusing for customers at the minute, isn't it? You talked about the test and release strategy being launched next week, but then you've still got the FCDO's advice, which, is against travel to most areas. And as you say, that news this morning about Brexit, it's all so confusing. I wonder whether January might offer some clarity potentially, because obviously these things will have to go one way or another in terms of what happens.
Yeah, and the other thing I think we've talked here before is I think all of this plays into the hands of travel professionals and people who are running travel businesses, because all of that confusion isn't taking away from the fact that people want holidays. The product is definitely not, the demand for the product is not in question at all. This is about getting people comfortable enough to put that commitment down. And so whilst in lots of other sectors of retail, you've seen this huge jump to, channel shift to online, that probably won't ever reverse. You've got all these people who have got used to a fairly slick grocery delivery operation, for example, that maybe won't go back to queuing in Sainsbury's anymore. But I think travel, you could make a strong case for going the opposite direction for all the reasons we've talked about. Digital online tour operators generally have fared more poorly at dealing with customers. All of that confusion and complexity that you talked about, it feels like having a human being to be able to say, this is the bit of paper you need to prove your vaccine. This is what you're going to have to do if you go to this country. When you cross the border, this is the process. All of that, I think, plays into the hands of our industry. Definitely.
That's one positive point there. We've had a question from one of our attendees that was pre-submitted about asking about our financial failure insurance. On previous webinars, we obviously discussed difficulties in the market, and we've been asked if a company fails to renew their FFI, whether they can hibernate and reapply later. I mean, this is one for me potentially. I mean, the answer depends on whether your FFI, your financial failure insurance, supports another protection scheme such as ABTA or ATOL. If you hold FFI solely for non-air packages, then you can reapply at a later date and hibernate your business in the meantime. However, if you hold ABTA or ATOL, this would need to be discussed with them, as they might not be willing to pause your license or membership. I think everyone's circumstances are different, so it's best to speak to us individually about this, and we can facilitate those discussions. But however, in all of these situations, if you don't hold financial protection, such as the financial failure insurance, obviously you won't legally be permitted to take new bookings, so business should be paused. Martin, I mean, obviously the lack of insurance is been in the public sector, in the news over the last couple of weeks. It's still obviously causing significant problems. I mean, what's your outlook for insurance in the travel sector over the next few months?
Yeah, I still think that recovery of the insurance will probably lag the recovery of travel companies, because I think, talking to insurers just yesterday, for example, I think there's a fear that taking on new risks at this point, new exposures, when they don't quite know what risks lie in their existing portfolio is the big challenge for them. A lot of the credit committees have just simply shut up shop and said no more travel until we know how the land lies. Now, the vaccine news, for all you've got me being miserable about it and casting sort of doubts on how immediate the impact is going to be. In some respects, it doesn't matter what I think if the wider industry and the insurance credit committees all think it's good news and gives that. I mean, just in the last week, we've had a couple of conversations with insurers, still a long way from them committing. We've had insurers conversations with private businesses with offers from private equity firms, all this stuff that just a few months ago looked miles off, because people are starting to say, well, if vaccine is the beginning of the end, there's a timing thing. You know, if I'm an insurer looking to make a play for a new market, as soon as there's a bit of upside, I'll go for it. So I think it'll take a while, but you never know. And if there's a continual compounding of this good news, you might see it come back early. But just would second your comments there, Chris, and I'm very happy to help if anybody has those sorts of issues, you know, on an individual company basis, if they're looking for alternatives, because there are fewer alternatives clearly, and most of the alternatives available do require some kind of collateral of some sort, usually cash backed, but there may well be solutions we can come up with, even if they're interim, until things get back together. So look, my contact details are on the screen there, and you know, feel free to get in touch if I can help.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate that, and thank you for joining us. We'll move on to Adam now. I know Adam had Wi-Fi issues earlier. Hopefully he's still there and he'll be able to share his screen with us.
Oh, yeah, I think Chris, can you see me now?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, that's great.
Is my video on?
No, your video's not on, but we can see your screen.
Oh, 1 second. I think I can do that. Yes. Okay.
Great, thank you.
No problem. Good morning, everybody. So, as Chris said, going to talk about TOMs and currency today. I think as we draw closer to the end of 2020, and hopefully we've reached the beginning of the end to this pandemic, although, as Marty said, not quite sure how long that recovery is going to take. I just wanted to cover off two points really. One is TOMs, VAT. You may have seen or may not have seen the changes that ABTA announced last week, but it's been agreed in principle with HMRC, although we do await a couple of finer details, which I'll come on to. And the second topic today I'll cover off is currency, certainly a common area in which we advise clients. One that was a big concern 9 months ago, has somewhat dropped off the radar for most people over the past 8 or 9 months. As we prepare for the world to return to some kind of normal, hopefully, I think you need to be thinking about currency in your business and potentially what you're exposed to. So let's talk about TOMs VAT first. The scheme is changing for departures on or after the 1st of January 2021, and this applies, we're pretty confident, in a deal or no deal scenario. The key difference for trips departing from this date and taking place within the UK will be standard rated, whereas trips taking place anywhere outside the UK will become 0 rated. Just as a bit of a recap about TOMs, it still applies to those businesses selling direct to consumers and business to business, where trips are enjoyed by that business but not resold. B2B or wholesale, as it's better known, will remain optional, and I can't imagine that anyone would voluntarily use that scheme. The scheme is going to cover off the same suppliers. Just quickly, a quick reminder of those: accommodation, passenger transport, hire of a means of transport, use of airport lounges, guides, and excursions. Some of the other points that remain the same, and just a continued reminder, the tax point. Most of you, I would imagine, are using departure date as your tax point, and that will continue to be the same. I think if we can look for any silver linings this year, if you've had trips postponed from 2020 into 2021, hopefully you would have priced in your TOMs VAT into the margin. If all other variables remain the same and underlying costs don't change, etc., then you stand to make more profit per booking, as you're no longer going to be suffering the VAT on those EU departures. So that's certainly one positive from this. Cancellation income, that remains free of TOMs. Annual calculation, you're still required to perform an annual calculation, and that will remain the same. The overall scheme has not changed, even though EU trips become 0 rated, and so effectively you'd still be expected by HMRC to do that annual calculation. Just thinking about your next one as well, which we will come on to shortly, but unless you've got a 31st of December year end, your calculation is potentially going to straddle both the old and the new scheme, but I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later on. Provisional percentage, again, most of you will be aware that usually your TOMs VAT each quarter is based on a provisional percentage from your prior year calculation. This continues to remain the same, although your 2020 calculation is likely to be very different to usual because of this pandemic. I believe at this stage, although probably need confirmation from HMRC, but they will consider allowing you to use 0% as your provisional percentage if all of your sales are going to be outside of the UK. So just what to think about looking forward into 2021 and the transition calculation. As I said earlier, if you're 31st December year end, it's really straightforward, and you'll have an old calculation and then you move on to the new scheme on the new rules post 1st of January 2020 or 21. If your year end does straddle the 31st of December, then you effectively have to split your calculation. And there are two ways in which you can do that. I'll just come on to a couple of examples and then come back to that slide. So choice number one, you can do two separate calculations. Effectively, you can see here we've got a 31st of March 2021 year end. And you can see on the left-hand side, you've got a calculation from 1 April 2020 up to December, and that calculates a margin. And then under the new rules, you would calculate your VAT liability post January. You can see down in the screen there, you've got a liability of 22,867. The second way of doing this is really a combined calculation. You can see here we've just got an example of that on screen. For those of you or the eagle eyes will see that the liability is slightly less under this calculation. You do have a choice, and so I think it's important that you review both of these when you're doing your next calculation, especially if you've got the straddle. If you've got a higher mix of EU post 1st of January, then this combined calculation does present an opportunity to yield a slightly lower TOMS liability. So certainly worth looking at, although in this example is not necessarily a material difference, but will depend on your circumstances. Just coming back to this slide, transport company. For those of you who do use a transport company, will it still be required? Well, that will depend really on your business. If you don't have any trips that will take place in the EU, or you don't plan to sell trips in the EU, then you could consider no longer using this vehicle. You should have had all your transport contracts within this business for the scheme to be effective, and so you would need to move those contracts out for transport into the main trading company. Then effectively you could look to strike the company off or keep it dormant. If you do sell or are planning to sell the UK, which we've seen some operators do as they diversify through this pandemic, then you may want to keep a transport company. There is a potential that HMRC are going to agree an apportionment method. This would effectively allow you to do away with the transport company and apportion your costs by the VAT rate, but within the usual calculation. But as I said, we're waiting on confirmation from that, so more to follow. There is I guess a caveat that comes with this. As you will know, the TOM scheme exists as a simplification measure, which means that you don't need to register in the member states in which your trips take place. There is a small risk that territories could require you to register locally, and this would mean that you need things like a fiscal representative. Although I do think it remains a small risk, but it's certainly something to be aware of. In terms of TOMS, well, that's it really. They're the main updates. If anybody does have any questions, happy to take them at the end. I'll just move on to currency. I think as well that the calculation that I've shown you, we can certainly look at sharing. Happy to do that as well. Just come on to this slide. Okay, so currency. What have we seen over the past 12 months? Well, I'll take a quick look at two of the major currencies in which most of our clients deal with. GBP, US dollar is the first one. As you'll be able to see from the graph on screen, the 1 year change has been 5.6%, but actually we've seen a maximum swing of down at 12.5% as the pandemic took hold on the world back in March. albeit we've seen quite a good recovery in the GBP to dollar. But unfortunately, you'll see here from the next graph that the euro is just as volatile back in March and April, but we haven't quite seen the same recovery here. What has this meant for 2020 and tour operators? Well, it really depended on what positions you were holding back when everything kicked off. Many of our clients had already protected a portion, most of their risk at that point in time. And that meant back in March and April, they were sitting on 4 contract positions that were no longer required. If you had a good FX partner, then you should have been offered some degree of flexibility to either cancel or move those contracts out to a future date. Fortunately, because of the depreciation in the pound at that point, those contracts were effectively in the money for a lot of the clients that we work with. And I think given the position that most of those companies were in at that time, along with the rest of the industry, there was an opportunity to close out those 4 contracts and take the profit, which ultimately helped cash flow. And as we know, cash was and still remains king. So looking back, it was certainly the right decision at that time. And as we know now, most of those bookings have been cancelled or postponed into 2021 and beyond. What does the future look like? Well, quite frankly, I think my guess is as good as this little man on screen. We certainly still have factors at play, which have weighed on markets over recent months. Obviously, Brexit still influences day to day and week to week as we loom closer to the end of the transition period. The pandemic and its wider effects on global economies in general will continue to mean major currencies, certainly most that you're exposed to, will be volatile for some time. I think if you look at the predictions from most of the major institutions, they vary wildly over the next 12 months. Certainly there appears to be a split on the opinion around the US dollar. Some predicting 1.28 by December 2021, whereas others 1.5. The opinion on the euro, if you look at it, that it isn't expected to strengthen, or the GBP isn't expected to strengthen rather against the euro too much throughout 2021. So with that in mind, really as a travel business, what should you be thinking about? Certainly, I think it's now time to start reviewing your business from a currency perspective. What exposure have you already got? Are you already carrying with existing bookings? What were they costed at? Is there an opportunity to protect, but maybe at a better rate than you were costed? Certainly the opportunity might exist with some of the currencies like the US dollar at the moment. You want to consider how much to protect though, without being pessimistic or too pessimistic. As I said, we're only at the beginning of the end, and 2021 certainly isn't going to be plain sailing. I would consider protecting a lower percentage of your overall exposure, to be honest. That would give you some wiggle room to manoeuvre. As it also look at the pricing, will that allow you to book a forward over a longer period of time, perhaps? Again, just giving you the opportunity to de-risk that commitment. If bookings are pushed out further into 2021 than you might expect, or even into 2022, you need to protect the currency, but also not be over-committed too much. Are you selling new destinations? Does that mean you need to protect new currency? What does that look like? Are you prepared for that? Also consider your risk appetite. We meet varying types of business owners and directors, and they've all got different attitudes to risk. I think it requires careful thought for this year. 2020 has been pretty tough, to put it politely. 2021 for me is about maximising what you can, but capping any downside risk where possible. For those customers that have rolled over their bookings, the last thing you want to do is lose out on any of that margin contribution to currency exposure. What strategy are you going to deploy? Again, this will change from 2020. I think you can almost rip up the rule book and start afresh. Gone are the days where you can book chunks of currency based on forecasts and expectations. Although I'm hopeful that at some point bookings will return in abundance, quite frankly, it's unknown at this stage. And so I think it's about shorter term strategies that keep you agile, certainly worth looking forward, but not taking anything for granted. As we see across different areas of finance, it's all about staying nimble and being more proactive as we see how 2021 unfolds. Protect your exposure with hedging products. That's what I'd recommend, but also have some built-in protection within your margin already. If you don't, usually we'd expect to see around 2 to 5% built in just in your margin within your booking system and your pricing. Inbound currency. This may be something you have or don't have, but certainly if you're selling to overseas customers and accepting payments in local currency, there's a really nice opportunity to naturally protect any outgoing payments in that same currency. All this really requires is the right setup between your merchant acquirer and your FX partner to facilitate that. I think it saves time, effort and money in those regards. And as I said, really be a bit more proactive and less reactive, really, to make sure you're ahead of the game as much as can be. I think going into 2021 as well, I would recommend that you look at your FX provider. Here's a few things that I would recommend that you look for. Much like merchant acquirers that we've seen over recent months and other stakeholders in the travel industry, they're certainly looking at travel businesses and seeing quite a risk. You may find that they're no longer willing to offer credit. And this obviously puts you in a really difficult position should you want to hedge any positions that you have. So I'd recommend having more than one supplier in place with good relationships. You've got fallback options. How have they treated you over the recent months? Have they been flexible? Have they been helpful? Are they the right business partner for you going forward? Again, really that point there on flexibility. We've seen some be flexible over the pandemic, but with the uncertainty that exists, can they be flexible going forward? In terms of their overall dealings with you, but the product that they offer. Trust, obviously a big one. We talk about trust from a customer perspective and building that trust within the industry, but can you trust your suppliers? The worst thing that we see is clients that are just unaware of things that are built into the FX margin and just hidden fees, etc. So make sure that you've got a good partner and you can trust them. Technology, this is linked to really payments as well, but not just hedging products, but does the FX provider have a good platform, good technology that makes it easy for you to understand and facilitate what you need? Obviously, price is going to be important throughout 2021. As I said, fees on margin, make sure they're transparent, make sure your payment fees aren't too excessive for facilitating the payments to suppliers. Time and again, we see people being overcharged in various areas when it comes to FX. And then lastly, payment solutions, as I touched on, really what we see and what we do and the providers that we work with often have supplier payments built into the platform. And so that makes life a lot easier for finance teams. And there are some more sophisticated products out there. Some of the larger OTAs or businesses, if you've got the right technology, you can actually protect your currency on a more granular level using APIs. Something to consider if you're in that position. I think that's it from me, Chris. Thanks for listening. That was quite a quick canter through both those subjects, but happy to take any questions on either, really.
Thanks, Adam. That was really useful and some good pointers there for people to look at. Just one question, moving back to Tom's quickly. You said that there's the potential that people might have to register in member states. When will we have clarity on that? Is it reliant on Brexit? Will we know in January, do you think?
Unfortunately not, Chris. If you look at other territories that sell into the EU at present, they haven't been required to register. It really would be down to each member state, and so you could get one or two, or you could get a raft requiring registration. There is a question around, competitiveness. Obviously, selling into the EU from the UK now would arguably slightly more competitive from our perspective, but equally it works the other way. So there is certainly motivation for member states requiring registration, but would they enforce that? I think remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you. And obviously your details are on the screen if anyone has got any questions at all, and we'll circulate your slides so that people can see the information that you've presented there. So thank you very much. we're a little bit short on time because I know Bruce has another webinar to go on to. So we'll move on to Bruce if that's okay. But if anyone does have any questions on TOMS or currency, then Adam is staying with us till the end, so we can come back to them potentially. So Bruce, welcome back to the Travel Vault webinar. You joined us back in April when we were in our first full lockdown, and our emphasis back then was on maintaining a presence with customers rather than advertising your products as such. Obviously a lot has happened since then, and there's still enormous pressure on the industry. How have you things changed? How have you seen things change over the last few months? Has there been a move to actively advertising products and encouraging bookings, or is it very much still playing it carefully?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for welcoming me back. Yeah, it's a very different scenario. It seems like a world away, doesn't it? April. So yeah, it's you know, we're noticing much more activity in terms of selling. Or be more selling specific offers, and also just being more kind of positive about sales that are going to be possible coming up. So there's in terms of the kind of the travel agent market, there's been a lot more activity that we're seeing where people are just feeling more confident to be able to put offers out there. There are some countries and that also where there has been those opportunities, then travel agents have jumped on those and been able to, you know, make some headway there. And also, as Martin was saying earlier on, whilst travel is not possible now, or maybe even like in, you know, January to Easter might be tricky, probably will be tricky. People will be looking ahead. People are desperate. They kind of know we're not out of the woods yet, and there's a lot of vaccinations need to happen. But I think people's mindset has changed. People are now starting to think about the future. And whilst they might not be confident enough to go on holiday in Easter, or maybe some people might not be confident to go on holiday in summer, but they will be looking at, you know, mid to late 2021 or 2022. We just did a promotion this morning for Silver Sea Cruises, and they just released their 22-23 brochure. So there's some kind of we're doing a promotion with them right now. So there is kind of optimism. I think from we also work with tourism boards, so national tourism boards, and we've definitely noticed, as for B2C and B2B, so we've definitely noticed a movement there in the last maybe like 4 weeks, where you just feel as though there's more positivity, more forward thinking about what's going to happen next year. I think from my experience, I'm a bit like Martin, I'm ever the optimist, and I think the national tourism boards are going to be the lifeblood for travel marketing in Q1. I think that they're all sitting on quite a lot of government money and waiting for the right moment to start promoting their destination and therefore travel. So where there's, you know, that's gonna we'll see that take off at some point, and when it does, these guys tend to be quite competitive. So one big destination will start promoting, the others will start promote as well. So I think there will be an element of a little bit of a explosion of marketing, talking about not traveling like right now, but traveling for the future. And I think that will just bounce off around the travel industry. Tour ops will be able to do some some partnership deals with tourism boards, and then travel agents can like get on top of those. You know, commercial operators will start feeling just feel more positive. So it's definitely moving, and I think from your members' point of view, it's important to kind of get ready for that wave, but also do it in an appropriate way. And whilst people were talking today, I've just made a few notes, kind of things I wanted to get across, and I've ended up with quite a cheesy but cool 5 Ps. Got 5 Ps to share with you, which we should really have a PowerPoint for this, but we did it live. So number 1, I would say, is pandemic. So be pandemic conscious, and just avoid being gung ho and saying, yeah, we can all travel now, it's going to be great, and don't worry about it. So we have a responsibility to promote travel and tourism correctly. So even things like when you're you don't want to be talking about anyone when you're talking about circumventing rules. Mm-hmm. If you're sharing images of resorts or hotels which are pre-COVID, times where they're not wearing masks and there's no kind of hand sanitizers, then be aware of that and maybe mention that in the copy.
Yeah.
So people, customers are not daft. They're going to want to know what to expect. They're very hypersensitive to exactly how much is their holiday going to be affected. So you can't paper over that. You need to address it. It's not the most ideal thing to be talking about when you're trying to sell a holiday, which is supposed to be a nice, relaxing experience, and you're talking about 9 hours on the flight with a face mask, but that is a reality. So you can't dress it up. It is what it is, and we just need to be honest. And the second P would be professionalism, which was what Martin alluded to as well, which is it's a really big opportunity for travel agents to express their professionalism and establish their credibility, because information is really important at the moment. It's not easy booking holidays. Everyone's worried about what to expect, and every country is bloody different. So you need that expertise, you need that help in hand, and that's where the professionalism of travel agents will come in. And I think it's a really good opportunity to make hay in this period, to get to get the members of the public to appreciate the great service the travel agents will be doing.
Yeah.
Thirdly, I'd say planning. Third P is planning. So plan for what's going to happen. It's going to start getting a little bit busier. More things will start coming in line. It's not going to go the other way. It's only going to go one way now in general. So more places will open up. So plan for that, and plan for what, even just events that happen in the world, even things like just content calendars. Just get ready, because it's very difficult to kind of do social when you're trying to do all the, if you like, proper work. So it's try to get in a habit for 2021 to plan more, so you're not having to just react all the time. You have to react to kind of the COVID announcements. I mean, Grant Shapps will announce in a minute, the new corridors or not. So we'll panic about that every Thursday. So some things you can't plan for, but some things you can. So just try to kind of knock off the ones you can, so you've got like a decent chance of getting ahead of everything. Number 4, personal. Another P, personal, is the personal touch is really important. And what's happened in the last 9 months is everyone's jumping on these Zooms and Teams and all sorts. Video is really important, and buying from people is key. So there's no excuses anymore. We've got to get personal, and we've got to try to use our social media channels in a way which reflects our own personalities and the personality of the business. So don't hide behind logos and sunset images. You need to get in front of the camera now. There's no excuses. People expect it. So do some live videos talking about the most recent updates and chatting with customers that way. Just really, really valuable way of marketing you and your business. And finally, promote is my final P. So it's going to be when it's going to be increasingly busy and competitive as things start turning, whether that's January, February, March, and peaks would be weird. It just kind of carry on probably. So it's really important to realise that it's very competitive out there. For everyone's going to be, it's going to be a bun fight. Everyone's going to be really trying to get the attention of customers. That's your members and their local competitors, agencies, and also everyone else. All the tour, OTAs and tourist boards and airlines. It's going to be crazy. So it's really, you can't get away with just doing a couple of posts organically on Facebook anymore. You need to learn how to promote properly. And I think I badgered everyone about this in April. It's the same thing. It's just got to learn and get confident about using Facebook ads to cut through to your target audience. You can't leave it to chance. So there's my 5 Ps for you, Chris. So we had pandemic, professionalism, plan, personal approach, and promotion.
That's fantastic.
I'll take a breath now.
Thanks, Bruce. No, I think that's really helpful. And I think, putting it into those 5 Ps has been really useful to give people some tips. I mean, obviously, on our previous webinar, as you said, we went into detail on a few other things, and that webinar is still available on YouTube there if anybody wants to look back at that. I know you have another webinar to join, so as we don't have any questions from the attendees, I will allow you to join that other webinar so that you can prepare for that. But that's really useful, and just want to say thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again in the new year.
Yeah, let's do that. And Merry Christmas, everyone, and all the best. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. So thank you to everyone for joining us. This is the last webinar of the year, and it's certainly been a challenging year. We're obviously hoping for a more positive 2021, and we will continue to support you throughout this. We will send out newsletters next week to make sure that we've passing on all the advice that we've given today. But as always, if you have any queries or need any advice, then please get in touch with us. Otherwise, it's just for me to wish you all a peaceful Christmas break. Take care, everyone, and thank you very much.